Max Verstappen gets a hand and a half on a fourth world driver's title after delivering one of the drives of his Formula One career, winning the Sao Paulo Grand Prix from 17th on the grid. Elsewhere, you'll never guess who completed the podium. Alpine finished second and third as Lando Norris, well, his title hopes can wait for next season. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined, as always, at the end of this triple header by lead editor Ian Parks. Ian, where do you start? Because we've had not one, but two sessions for the ages today on Sunday at Interlagos. Perhaps one of the best qualifying sessions F1 has ever seen to kick off the day Sunday morning. 5 crashes, a couple of those being quite big, 5 red flags, both Red Bulls out in Q2, Lewis Hamilton out in Q1, Lando on pole, but ultimately qualifying didn't really matter for Red Bull because Max Verstappen, I mean, he's got a lot of criticism recently for some of the things he's done in Mexico City, for example, but from 17th on the grid, he made up 6 places on lap 1 alone to win the Sao Paulo Grand Prix, effectively meaning he can now win the title in Las Vegas. I mean, that was the drive of not a 3-time world champion, but a 4-time world champion.
That's a lovely turn of phrase, Nick. Very nicely put there, mate. That's a good introduction, I've got to say. You thought up that one very well. I mean, Max could have started somewhere in downtown Sao Paulo, and I think he still would have won that race. It was a performance that laid to rest and swept aside all the criticism that he encountered post Mexico City, as you mentioned, because naturally he did come in for quite an amount of criticism given his driving standards, shall we say, and the 2 incidents with Lando Norris that led to those 2-second penalties. A lot of people saying that, he didn't need to resort to those tactics. We know what kind of driver Max is. He is a 3-time world champion. He's got those 3 world titles on merit. And today he delivered a performance for the ages. Qualifying, let's just briefly touch on that.
Yeah.
Didn't make it out of Q2 simply because there was a crash involving Lance Stroll right at the end of Q2. There was a bit of a delay as to the red flag being issued, but by the time it was, with Max just about to embark on a push lap, out came the red flags. That denied him the opportunity to set a decent qualifying time. 12th on the timesheet, 5-place grid penalty for an additional change of the internal combustion engine, 17th on the grid. Effectively 15th, you could argue, because there were 2 cars ahead of him that didn't start, one being Alex Albon. Unfortunately, one of those involved in the 5 red flag qualifying incidents. His car irreparable in time. And then, of course, Lance Stroll spun on the formation lap. Weird one, that. Something, I'm not going to blame Lance for that one. There was something really weird that when he put his foot on the brake and the car just completely lost it upon him. But nevertheless, feeble excuse trying to extricate himself from the position he was in and beached his car in the gravel. So that meant, as I say, 2 cars that would have been ahead of him weren't ahead of him. But nevertheless, still 17th on the grid and just a consummate drive. As I wrote in one of my pieces, whereas virtually every other driver around Max made a mistake somewhere during that Grand Prix, Max did not put a single wheel out of place. And I'm going to borrow your phrase from your introduction. It was the drive of an impending 4-time world champion, because right now he has a 62-point cushion over Lando Norris. Lando could only finish 6th from pole position. He made mistakes in that Grand Prix, and that, bottom line, underlines the difference between those 2 drivers. Max was professional, was perfect, peerless. Lando, as we've seen on occasions throughout this season, yes, he's been great on occasions, But this was one of those races where he did make errors, and ultimately it's cost him.
And it's funny you mentioned Lando Norris, because actually Lando said after the race that Max was so quick that had the reigning world champion started at the front of the field, that actually he would have lapped not just a few drivers, but everyone, including Lando, which just shows how incredible Max was. And it was one of the best drivers of his career, if not the best. And for those watching this F1 update, let us know in the comment section below if you think that was Max Verstappen's greatest F1 victory. And as you mentioned there, it means that he can now win the title in Las Vegas. And really, in our private work chat, we were saying ahead of the race with our Dutch colleagues at Racing News 365.nl that actually for the Brazilian Grand Prix, despite starting from pole, it was Lando who had all the pressure, not Max starting from P17, because as we pointed out, Max going into the race had a 44-point advantage, which meant that actually he could afford a bad race and still be leading pretty comfortably. The opposite has happened. It's Lando who's had the bad race, through one of his own errors. Of course, a bit of bad luck as well with the timing of the red flag for Franco Colapinto crashing and the safety car it triggered and just everything that's unfolded. But in fairness to McLaren and Lando, they've had their own shares of luck this season, which has gone against Red Bull. Yeah. It was one of those races where, it was, as it did for Alpine, staying out on what were pretty shot intermediate tyres was the way to go. But there was such torrential rain, though. It was mental, Ian. How do you sum up the Brazilian Grand Prix? Because there are stories everywhere.
Mental, chaotic, pandemonium on occasions, particularly during that qualifying session. To have 5 red flags, which has equaled the Formula One record, just sums it all up, really. I mean, I was working this morning on the qualifying session with 2 of my colleagues. You were obviously off for the morning session, but it was just chaotic in the writing sense as what we were watching unfold on screen as well was just equally as chaotic. And for anybody at the track as well, it would have been chaos. 7:30 a.m. start local time, the earliest start time to a qualifying session in Formula One history. So wherever you look, as you say, stories being made. And the great stat that I love that's come out of this is that for only the 6th time in 1,122 Grand Prix, we have a winner of a Grand Prix that has started from 17th or lower on the grid. That just emphasizes just how great a performance that was from Max Verstappen. As I say, forget the fact that there were 2 empty spaces ahead of him on the grid.
Yeah.
This was still the hallmark drive of one of the all-time greats. Let's put it that way. He's now going to win this 4th world title. His name is going to stand there alongside Alain Prost, of course. A driver that we regard, many people regard as an absolute legend. When Max retires, we will be looking upon him as an absolute legend. And for me now, this title is done and dusted. It's now all about the Constructors' Championship, because that is a much closer race between McLaren, Ferrari, and Red Bull. Red Bull has managed to make a degree of inroads with Max winning this Grand Prix, but it's still a 49-point cushion to McLaren. With Ferrari, how many points did you say, Nick? You did remind me.
Yep. Ferrari are 36 points behind, still in second. Red Bull are 49 points behind. So actually, in the constructors' standings, even Red Bull are very much back in it, but again, kind of without Checo fighting for them.
Yeah. So there's still an awful lot to play for in that Constructors' Championship. That one I definitely can see going to the last race in Abu Dhabi. But it looks like Max now has a really good chance of being crowned in Las Vegas. And I'm smiling because I remember when I attended that Grand Prix last year, and there was all that fanfare and pandemonium and typical Las Vegas razzmatazz that went around the build-up to the Grand Prix, and Max just was not enamored with it at all. Far from it. In fact, he was heavily critical, which is something the race organisers, being F1, of course, because they are the race promoters of that Grand Prix, did not appreciate. So as I say, 12 months on, he's now got this opportunity to win in the place that he did not like just a year ago. But it's what goes around comes around. But Max most definitely is going to be worthy of his fourth world title on the basis of this drive alone today, because that was, for me, one of the best drives I've seen in covering Formula One. And for me as well, that was Max Verstappen's best drive of his Formula One career. We've got a poll running on the Racing News 365 website where we asked the question, was that Max's best win of his F1 career? There's a few options in there, such as his first victory with Red Bull on his debut. Obviously, Spain 2016 took advantage of Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg taking each other out on that first lap. And then, of course, we've got the 2021 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, arguably the most contentious Grand Prix in Formula One history. Was that his best victory? For me, no. For me, it was this one on Sunday, the Sao Paulo Grand Prix, just without a shadow of a doubt, a superb performance.
I should point out that we're recording this update at 11 p.m. UK time, which is actually about five and a half hours after the race finished, which is quite extraordinary. But there's a very good reason for that, and it's because, you mentioned it a little bit, it's because of something that happened at the start of the race, triggered by Lance Stroll spinning out, ending up beaching the gravel on the formation lap. And we've been waiting, actually, and we have now got it, for a verdict on Lando Norris, who, I'll let you explain what happened and what he's received, but in my opinion, I think he's a little bit lucky.
I know what you're thinking there, Nick. You're thinking, well, did he deserve a time penalty? But it's one of those procedural elements, particularly as this was such a unique circumstance. As you say, as I've mentioned, Lance spun off on the formation lap. And sadly for him, on a wretched day for him and Aston Martin, bearing in mind he was also one of the five guys that caused a red flag in qualifying. So that was his second incident of the day. It led to this aborted start because he had beached his car in the gravel. All the other cars had lined up on the grid waiting for the start, but of course his car had to be retrieved by the marshals, of course. So what happened was there was a signal that came through that it was an aborted start, and Lando Norris decided, for whatever reason, to just leave the grid and go round again. What that did, that triggered George Russell and the two RBs of Yuki Tsunoda and Liam Lawson, who was second, third, and fifth on the grid, respectively, basically taking Lando's lead and following him off the grid. The likes of Esteban Ocon performed brilliantly. He decided to stay in his grid spot where he knew the procedure. So basically what happened was that there was this, we've had to wait a long time for these stewards' documents to come through. Was Lando going to get a time penalty that potentially could have dropped him further down the order, might have cost him another couple of points, a few, 2, maybe 4 points if he dropped to 7th, 8th, or wherever. As it turns out, it's all procedural. Yes, Lando did instigate it. However, they've taken certain mitigating circumstances into effect that it was quite unique circumstances, the way this unfolded. And the bottom line is they've given him a €5,000 fine. The three drivers behind him, George, Yuki, and Liam, no penalty because they were just effectively following Lando's lead. So it's a case of, as you were with regard to the championship standings, a 62-point gap. But it still means that Max still has this initial opportunity to win this fourth world title in Las Vegas. If it's not going to be there, then you've got to believe it's going to be in Qatar. This drivers' championship is not going to go down to the wire in Abu Dhabi unless something truly dramatic happens over these next two Grand Prix.
Well, speaking of dramatic, I don't think dramatic's the right word. I think extraordinary, surprising, unexpected, or as Pierre Gasly put it, not on anyone's bingo card. Alpine, second for Esteban Ocon, third for Pierre Gasly. Huge points for the team for the Constructors' Championship in what is now a massive fight for P6 between Alpine, Haas, and RB. But I mean, Esteban Ocon had been quick throughout Sunday, qualified fourth for the race. Pierre Gasly didn't qualify as well, was several places back, but nevertheless, a double Alpine podium. I mean, you couldn't even make that up.
Quite remarkable. Astonishing, because this is a team that prior to today had only scored 16 points across the previous 20 Grand Prix. Yes, the Sao Paulo Grand Prix was the 21st of the season. Just had to check myself then because quite extraordinary. Yeah, I know, only 3 to go. And they've scored 33 points in one Grand Prix. This, to put it into perspective, this is a multi-million-dollar leap up the constructors' standings. They were 9th, they're now 6th. There's 5-point gap between Alpine in 6th, Haas in 7th, RB in 8th. This means an awful lot to these 3 teams. That amount of money, and just to clarify when I'm talking about that amount of money, obviously teams get so much money from the prize pot from F1 from where they finish in the constructor standings. So from 6th to 8th, and from 6th to 9th, bearing in mind where Alpine were, we are talking somewhere in the region of about $15 to $20 million. So 6, 7, 8, Alpine, Haas, and RB, we're talking, as I say, somewhere then about $15 million, about $5 million per placing. So this was an enormous boost for Alpine, because it has been a simply wretched year for them, absolutely wretched. They've came from nowhere at the start of the season, and incrementally they've managed to have these odd little gains here and there. Then, of course, they've gone all through all of this palaver with regard to the power unit situation, losing Renault as its partner from 2026 onwards, the French manufacturer deciding to pull out after such a long and relatively glorious history in the sport. And for now, for this team to do this, and I talked about Max not putting a wheel out of place. The same can also be said pretty much for Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly. They were pretty much equally as faultless in that Grand Prix, and that's what has got them such a monumental, multi-million-dollar leap up the standings. Still 3 Grand Prix to play for.
There are.
And that's going to be one huge battle between those 3 constructors. Going to be a real interesting fight now over these final 3 Grand Prix. Alpine has definitely made a leap forward because, on merit, they've been getting Pierre Gasly in particular in recent Grand Prix has been reaching Q3. So it just shows the kind of leap forward that they have made. It's going to be a great, fascinating battle between those 3 teams, just as much as we got between McLaren, Ferrari, and Red Bull for the constructors' title this year.
And what's incredible was because both Ocon and Gasly actually changed their tyres during the red flag stoppage. Alpine's mechanics out of the pit crew didn't actually complete a pit stop during the race. So that's
remarkable.
They got to put their feet up a little bit. Just finally, you say that Alpine prior to this weekend had a bit of a wretched season. One team, and I don't think wretched is even a strong enough word to use to sum up their Brazilian Grand Prix, is Williams. I mean, where do you start? They have had not 1, not 2, but 3 crashes on Sunday in Sao Paulo, 2 of which were absolutely massive. It is fair to say 2 in qualifying, 1 in Q1 for Franco Colapinto, 1 in Q3, and that was the first very, very big one for Alex Albon, which meant, as you mentioned earlier in the show, he didn't even take part in the race just due to the sheer extent of the damage to his FW46. And then the reason why we had the red flag in the race was actually under the VSC. Franco Colapinto lost it at high speed as well, and even more remarkable damage to his car as well. I mean, Williams have had, through the fault of Albon and Logan Sargent, of course, some huge repairs this season. But now they have got 2 humongous repair jobs to do ahead of Las Vegas, because, I mean, there wasn't a lot left of either car.
Yeah, I mean, I remember only recently one Grand Prix where it was mentioned by Pat Fry, their technical director, that basically they'd run out of money. They're simply because of all the crashes this season, and I can't remember which one. I think it was Italian Grand Prix. I think even at that stage they were going into the Italian Grand Prix. Yeah, pretty certain it was now from memory. Pat turned around and said that because of all the crashes that had taken place over the course of this season, that at that particular point there was going to be no further updates on the car at all because they'd simply run out of cash with regards to adding anything to that car. And now, this, without quite clearly, probably one of the worst weekends in the team's history, you would assume.
Yeah.
Just one of probably the worst day in the team's history, given everything that has unfolded over the course of the space of 10 hours from probably even less than that, from Franco's crash in qualifying
in
Q1, and then obviously we had Alex's crash in Q3, which was huge. You could see the rear of that car had been totally destroyed, and Alex had called it himself pretty much immediately after the session that he knew, looking at the damage, that he was never ever going to compete in that Grand Prix, and so it was. And at that particular time, he set the second fastest time as well. He could have had a huge day for Williams. As it was, he was due to start from seventh, because obviously, those ahead, those behind had managed to set quicker times in Q3. Even from seventh, there was a possibility of him still having a good race, but it was never going to happen because of the damage to the car. And then to add that on top as well with Franco Colapinto's crash, that again was huge damage to that car. Thankfully for Williams, we now have two free weekends before we get into Las Vegas. We've got a Grand Prix next weekend. Boy, would they be in serious trouble of trying to get both cars on the grid, you would assume, because looking at the repair bill, not only the cost of it as well, significant for a team like that. And for them now to drop down to ninth in the constructors' standings, got to add in not just the cost of the crash damage today, but also now they've taken a $4, $5, potentially $6 million hit in the constructors' standings. This has been a wretched day and a really sad day for that team. Didn't deserve it, but unfortunately, this is what's happened. And I'm just going to make a side note as well, Nick. Because we're talking about Franco Colapinto here. So far, that we've praised all the rookies that have had an opportunity in this season. Ollie Behrman, Franco Colapinto, Liam Lawson. Today, all three of those drivers, I have to say, look like F2 drivers competing in F1, because all three of them made awful mistakes, both in qualifying and in the Grand Prix. I'm going to call it, and it's going to sound harsh, they looked out of their depth today. Yes, I know some of the drivers made mistakes as well, but not to the magnitude that those three did. There were spins, there were crashes, and I know we've praised them so far, and rightly so, because all three have done a magnificent job up to this point in their careers. But this was a day that potentially showed them all to be not quite ready for Formula One. So it's going to be quite a learning curve next season for Ollie Behrman. Who knows where Liam Lawson might end up? We're pretty confident he's going to get a seat somewhere, be it RB, maybe yet the second seat at Red Bull. Not quite sure now after that performance over this weekend. And Franco Colapinto as well. Again, on the edges. Who knows where he might end up? It looks like Bortoletto's going to get the second seat at stake now, 2025, alongside Nico Hulkenberg. from everything that we're hearing. So who knows where Franco might end up next season after this 9-race cameo. Looks like he's going to be on the outside looking in, but he's still got 3 races to prove himself again. But today, for those 3 drivers in particular, for me, they looked a little bit out of their depth.
Absolutely, and I think the big thing is there is so much for us to discuss on the Racing News 365.com podcast, which we'll be recording in, well, about 12 hours' time. Just to quickly run through the top 10 from the Sao Paulo Grand Prix. Max Verstappen claimed victory ahead of Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly. That's going to take a while for it to sound normal. George Russell finished 4th, Charles Leclerc in 5th, Norris 6th, Yuki Tsunoda in 7th, despite having started 3rd, Oscar Piastri 8th, Liam Lawson, who started in 5th, dropped down to 9th. Lewis Hamilton had picked up the final point in P10. The only thing left for me to say from behalf of Ian and I is thank you to all those who've been watching these videos and clicking on the Racing News 365.com website over this weekend, because it has been a record-breaking weekend for the company, and that's only possible thanks to all you guys. Ian, anything further to add on that point?
No, I think you've summed it up nicely there, Nick. As you say, it's been a mammoth weekend, a mammoth 3-week run.
Yeah.
I'll just conclude by saying that I'm delighted I'm going to be back on the road again. I will be in Las Vegas, folks. I am going to give you some fantastic backdrops, I promise you, particularly for the preview. Catch Nick and I doing that preview when I'm going to be in downtown Las Vegas. And it looks like at this stage, I could be very well recording the next F1 update across a weekend when Max Verstappen is going to be crowned a 4-time world champion. If not there, I'm also going to be in Doha for Qatar Grand Prix and in Abu Dhabi for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. So delighted to be back on the road again, but thank you ever so much for sticking with us over these past 3 Grand Prix weekends. Apologies for the constant backdrop that you often see behind me when we do these from when I'm at home, but nevertheless, it's been a pleasure to serve you folks. Keep those lovely comments coming below as well, and keep watching us on these updates, and keep those page views coming in as well. Thank you ever so much.
Only final thing to say is make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Racing News 365.com channel. Come on, please get us to 14,000 subscribers. Ian and I and Sam Absolutely Coop will see you on Monday for the podcast. See you later.
Take care, folks.